Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage 2019 AERA President, Amy Stewart Wells.
Good evening. I am Amy Stewart Wells, and I'm honored to be the president of the American Educational Research Association. On behalf of AERA, I am proud to welcome you all to join us here at the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center, and the hundreds more watching online, to the 15th Annual Brown Lecture in Education Research. If you are tweeting about tonight's lecture, the hashtag is AERA Brown Lecture. As a courtesy to our speaker and to all our guests, we ask that attendees please silence their cell phones. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with AERA, the American Educational Research Association was founded in 1916 and is the largest national scientific and scholarly society dedicated to advancing knowledge about education, to encouraging scholarly inquiry related to education, and to promoting the use of research to improve education and serve the public good. AERA publishes the top-ranked journals in the field and strives to make trusted knowledge widely accessible to diverse public and policy communities. We stand committed to the critical importance of education and to the role of education scholarship in making education a powerful and effective force for social change and justice. We also stand committed to the profession of teaching, to educational leadership, and to the other education professions, and to respectful and productive partnerships with families and communities. These commitments are central to why we are here tonight and what we will learn and discuss together. Before continuing this evening, I wish to acknowledge that we stand on the homelands of Indigenous peoples. Tonight, on the Piscataway land, I ask that you join me in recognizing the Indigenous peoples on whose land we stand. In 2004, AERA inaugurated what has become known around the country as the Brown Lecture, not only to commemorate the U.S. Supreme Court's landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Ed, but also to acknowledge the social scientists who at that time brought innovative ideas and methods to efforts to understand the myriad of inequalities in society. The Brown Lecture is an annual reminder of the important role that research can play in advancing equality in education. Tonight's lecture would not be possible without the generous support of the 20 Friends of the Brown Lecture, and I would like to acknowledge them and their generosity. The American Anthropological Association, the American Associations of Colleges for Teacher Education, American Institutes for Research, American Political Science Association, American Statistical Association, the Donna Ford Atala College of Educational Studies at Chapman University, Drexel University School of Education, Educational Testing Service, Foundation for Child Development, Indiana University Bloomington School of Education, Institute for Educational Leadership, Miami University College of Education, Health and Society, Peabody College of Education and Human Development at Vanderbilt University, Rutgers University Graduate School of Education, Sage Publications Incorporated, Society for Research and Child Development, the Spencer Foundation, the George Washington University Graduate School of Education and Human Development, University Council of Educational Administration, University of Maryland College of Education. Thank you, our friends. For your continued commitment and support. We would also like to thank the Brown Lecture Selection Committee, chaired by Tabby Chavis, for its efforts this year. The Brown Lecture was created to foreground and benefit from the role of research in advancing understanding of equality and equity in education. Each year, we select as our speaker a major scholar whose work has contributed powerfully to the struggles for justice and equity. Given the challenges we continue to face regarding injustice and racism in many education settings, institutions, the politics of the country, and communities around the country, it is timely that we have the opportunity tonight to learn from our colleague, Dr. Richard Milner. After Dr. Milner's lecture, he will be joined in our living room by a moderator and 2 experts in a forum discussion. Our commentators will make brief initial remarks to kick off the conversation, but we very much want those in the audience to feel part of our living room conversation. We encourage you to ask questions and to participate in the open discussion. Now I have the honor of introducing our 2018 Brown Lecture speaker. Dr. Milner is a leading scholar of urban education and teacher education. He is currently Cornelius Vanderbilt Endowed Chair of Education and Professor of Education in the Department of Teaching and Learning at Peabody College, Vanderbilt University. Prior to moving to Vanderbilt in August of this year, Dr. Milner spent 5 years as the Helen Faison Endowed Chair of Urban Education, Professor of Education, and by courtesy, Sociology, Social Work, and Africana Studies, as well as Director of the Center of Urban Education at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Milner's work has been cited or featured in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Atlantic, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Huffington Post, and National Public Radio. He is also the editor-in-chief of Urban Education and co-editor of the Handbook of Urban Education. In 2006, he received the AERA Early Career Award and became an AERA Fellow in 2016. He's also been honored with an AERA Outstanding Reviewer Award in 2015 and 2017 for his work on the editorial board of Educational Researcher. In 2016, he was awarded the John Dewey Society Outstanding Achievement Award for his scholarship Bridging Theory to Practice in the Spirit of John Dewey. Dr. Milner's work has appeared in numerous journals, and he has published 6 books. In the fall of 2015, the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education assigned his book, Racing to Class, to all incoming graduate students and invited alumni across the world to read. Dr. Milner's scholarship is at the forefront of a wave of post-desegregation research that asks us to broaden our focus beyond racial balance and demographics to equitable and sustaining teaching and learning within racially diverse schools. His writing requires us to move beyond assimilation and incorporation to a place of meaningful integration. We are honored tonight to be able to learn from Dr. Milner's deep knowledge and insights as he examines research on the practices and policies at the national, state, district, and local levels that are implicitly or overtly punishing rather than supporting the development of Black, brown, and low-income students, and discusses how to use that research to better help prepare and develop teachers. Please join me in welcoming the 2018 Brown Lecture of Education Research, Dr. Richard Milner.
Thank you.
And Hampton.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amy, for the gracious introduction, and to Felice and others responsible for my being here. Words cannot express how humbled I am to stand before you today. How are you all doing? All right, fantastic. I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge my daughters, Anna and Elise. I want to be clear that this is your last day out of school. And to my wife, Shelley, I want to say to you, I know you will be glad when this day is over so that you can get your hubby back, right? Several years ago, I faced a powerful experience as I searched for a preschool for my almost 4-year-old twin daughters. My dilemma was straightforward. How do I advocate for and choose a preschool that cultivated both their education needs and also their needs as Black girls? Drawing from the Mamie and Kenneth Clark Dahl test, which provided an empirical base for the Brown decision, child and human development scholar Margaret Bill Spencer has stressed the importance of young children's racial identity as well as their cognitive development. I want my daughters to develop an identity space that embraces their language, their dialect, their history, their hair, their ancestry, as well as their racial and cultural roots. In just 2 years, I have visited many preschool facilities, including home facilities, searching for the right place for my daughters. During one visit, a group of 5 students, were standing in the center of a classroom talking. There was 1 black boy, 3 white boys, and 1 white girl playing together in the classroom. As I watched, the preschool teacher told Jamal, you are too loud. Let's use your indoor voice, please. The teacher turned back to me and continued answering my questions. Soon, she turned again to the 5 youngsters, but again focused her words on 1. Jamal, you are too loud. I'm going to have to ask you to take your seat if you keep it up. Colleagues and friends, I was stunned. What I observed was a group of 5 students, that's right, I said it, yelling and not using their indoor voice, but this teacher heard only 1 voice, Jamal's. I wondered how this singling out may have affected Jamal's self-concept, his voice, and his identity. Coupled with my years of observations in middle and high school classrooms, this experience reminded me that in some contexts, exclusion as a form of punishment is based in part on race. I came to understand from data compiled by the Office of Civil Rights that disparity and inequality start in preschool. During the 2011 and 2012 academic year, although black students represented 18% of preschool enrollment, they made up 42% of preschool students who were suspended once, and 48%, almost half, of those who experienced suspension more than once. To ground this talk in an established body of scholarship, I present several themes against the landscape of the Brown decision, which declared state laws establishing separate schools for black and white students to be unconstitutional. In my quest to deepen my analysis of the books and articles I have read about Brown and my own research as a qualitative researcher, I asked educational researchers across discipline to nominate practicing and formal educators who could offer insights about the impact of the Brown decision on their experiences before, during, and after desegregation. My goal in studying the feedback of these educators was to confirm, nuance, and in some cases, counter themes available in the literature regarding Brown. My focus here is on race, the curriculum, and justice. By race, I mean that we're talking about far more than skin color. Race is socially constructed. Race is historically constructed. We also know that race is physically, not biologically constructed, and it's also contextually constructed when we think about issues of place. So you can't leave this lecture using race and skin color synonymously. Centering race, curriculum, and justice, 3 interrelated themes will emerge throughout this talk. First, post-Brown, we seem to have conflated or mixed up discipline practices with punishment practices. Second, Brown was about the curriculum because it was about what students have the opportunity to learn. In other words, educators play an enormous role in what gets covered in a curriculum, how long particular aspects of a curriculum are addressed, and how the curriculum is organized for student learning. And third, I share results of a sample of teachers who completed the Teachers Race Talk Survey, an exploratory national survey about race, the curriculum, and racial violence. In qualitative research, we privilege the voice of the participants and count their stories as data points that might be transferable to other situations and contexts. Let me introduce you to Mr. Willie Williams. Mr. Williams began teaching in 1961 and held positions as a teacher of social studies, art, business, and mathematics in Clark County, Alabama. He became an assistant superintendent and was an educator for 44 years in the very same district. During an interview in the school library where he taught in Grove Hill, Alabama, I asked Mr. Williams what the Brown decision meant to him.
Equality for the most part. And at that time, we really thought that we were years and years behind. But, once integration came, we found out that was not true. And it taught me this: you don't have to have the best resources in the world to produce. In other words, we made our own math, and naturally, we never heard of a computer. But the children excelled.
But the children excelled. Mr. Williams shares here what is consistent in the research literature about Brown. During segregation, Black teachers, Black students, and Black community members had assumed Black students were behind due to the lack of resources. But despite the lack of material resources in segregated schools, Black students excelled according to Mr. Williams. And the research literature shows that Black families were not necessarily pushing for integration, but for equality of resources. Hear me clearly, material resources that would allow Black students and teachers to maximize their learning and teaching capacities. Black schools during segregation, according to Mr. Williams, were not bad schools. They tended to be materially under-resourced, but rich in human and community, culture, capital, and assets. I asked Mr. Williams what propelled Black students to excel in all Black schools during segregation.
Good teachers, discipline, if you can capture their attention, show interest in them, things like that. That's what makes it. Because you can have all this, if you're not interested or motivated, then you're just sitting up in there. We knew the parents, and we lived in the same community. And I didn't have to tell the principal. On my way home in the afternoon, I just tell the parents. I nipped it in the bud.
Mr. Williams said that Black students excel because of good teachers and more. He explained that teachers knew the parents of their students and that teachers lived in the same community as their students and families. Based on his experiences, having worked with and interacted with hundreds of students and dozens of families, Mr. Williams dispelled a pervasive lie that Black parents did not care about their children or that they did not value education. Black parents cared about and they care about their children's education. The question is, do we as educators care about them? Throughout the interview, Mr. Williams consistently referred to discipline as germane to student success pre-desegregation. However, the way Mr. Williams talked about discipline during segregation was very different from how discipline is currently thought about, made sense of, theorized about, studied, and practiced today. For instance, take a look at these current data from the Office of Civil Rights. On the left-hand side of your screen, you will see a proportion of all students in schools. You see that? On the right-hand side of your screen, you will see the proportion of those students who experience inside-of-school suspension. Right? And so we're talking about Black students here. Black students represent about 15, almost 16% of the general population, but they represent 32% of those who experience in-school suspension. If you take a look at this slide, the next slide, the stats are even more startling. Black students, again, represent about 16% of the general population, but they represent 40% of those who experience outside of school suspension. And then some people have a nerve to ask me why I'm focusing on black students? Well, first of all, I can focus on whoever I want to focus on. But moreover, when we look at these data, it is clear that we need to really think about what is happening in schools to our students when we conceptualize and talk about this notion of discipline, when in fact, it seems to me we're punishing. However, I want to stress that discipline and punishment are not synonymous. There are certainly some relationships between them, but they are not the same thing. So we need to shift our languaging about exclusionary practices and consequently data patterns. Let's call them punishment practices, not disciplinary practices, to remain true to the core of what they are. Throughout my learning from Mr. Williams, and drawing especially from two texts, I want to conceptualize and share with you differences. Not yet. I want to share with you some features of what discipline versus punishment looks like. On the left-hand side, I share with you a book by Professor Tyrone Howard from UCLA. And in that book, he conceptualizes and he helps us make sense of why race and culture are important in the ways in which we think about approaching our work in schools. And then in my book, I attempt to advance and demonstrate practices in how teachers can actually actualize racial justice practices in their actual classroom. There was a teacher I was working with who shared with me, she said, "Rich, I'm just trying to get better," right? Shouldn't that be all of our orientation to our work, to get better, to start where we are, but not stay there? And so on the next slide, what you'll find is I have conceptualized the difference from my thinking between building disciplinary orientations and punishment orientations. Now, don't leave this talk saying I didn't give you anything practical, all right? Because if, from a design perspective, looking at the work of improvement science, we can really learn and build practices and cultivate opportunities for teachers to think about and to help students advance their work. So for instance, if we provide students multiple opportunities for success in a classroom and stop sending students out, suspending, expelling them, then we have a better opportunity to allow them to persevere and persist in spite of difficult situations. Imagine a child riding a bicycle, right? And that child falling off a bicycle. You know, the first time a child would fall off a bicycle, we wouldn't say, "Okay, you're done," right? We would pick that child up and put the child back on the bicycle so that he, she, they can continue, right? The same thing is true with our practices in schools. We need to give our students multiple chances to succeed. On the next slide, I continue by providing additional evidence spaces in terms of how we build disciplinary practices versus punishment practices. We need to invest in our individual students so that they understand that this work is not only about them. This work is about the collective, about the community. And so when students don't do well as an individual, they won't necessarily give up. These punishment practices can actually do more harm than good. Mr. Williams also pointed to the importance of black teachers before and after segregation. And he explained how black teachers were educated in historically black institutions first because they could not go anywhere else during segregation. But he also explained how his experiences at Alabama State helped him and his other black teacher colleagues become effective educators. I want to stress the importance of the historically black institutions of higher education. As a proud alum of South Carolina State University, these institutions, like public ones, need local, state, and federal financial resources and support in the education schools and units to advance innovation towards racial justice. Since Brown, we have seen a decline in the black teaching force, while student racial diversity is intensifying. To be certain about my point here, educational leadership scholar Linda Tillman and historian Vanessa Sitter Walker and educational researchers Gloria Latson Billings, Michelle Foster, and Jacqueline Irvine have all stressed how black educators were difference makers in the classrooms and in the communities during segregation. Although after desegregation, some white teachers focused on educational practices that mostly supported white student learning and development, I believe in the power and the potential of our teachers. I place my best bet on teachers. Research has shown that white teachers can be, and they are successful teachers of black students when they develop the knowledge, attitudes, mindsets, dispositions, and consequently practices to do so. But they do so not because they're good people or not because they have black friends. They do so because they put in the work to be successful. In practice, to adhere to the Brown decision, however, we moved and bussed bodies around, mostly black bodies, but get this, without a systemic strategy to address systemic strategies to help educators, students, and community members do the necessary work to live and learn across racial lines. Indeed, you might be surprised at the number of schools I walk into currently across the U.S. where teachers and other educators boast about the fact that they do not, they have not, and they will not address race in their talk, curriculum practices, or work more broadly. But power and privilege can allow some to avoid that which makes them uncomfortable, while others suffer the consequences of their silence, their shallow engagement, and their downright arrogance. Imagine an oncologist not studying, talking about, or teaching an aspect of cancer because he, she, they do not feel comfortable doing so. The punishment practices I described in this talk are reflective of broader policies and politics, advancing a law and order orientation to human behavior and experience. Educators try to control the bodies and minds of students, and they are too often treated like criminals rather than developing human beings. Consider, for instance, the dragging of a black girl in South Carolina for her disobedience. Educational researcher Russell Skiba has found that office referrals tend to originate in the classroom and that children of color are punished for what's known as subjective infractions, while white children are referred to the office for objective ones. For instance, black students are referred to the office for things like you're disrespectful or you're too loud. White students are referred to that's a subjective infraction or interpretation of a behavior. White students are referred to the office for things like, I look at my digital clock, you were supposed to be here at 1 o'clock, it's 1:03. You get the difference? These punishment practices manifest and contribute to a school to prison pipeline that should cause any of us to be morally and ethically energized to do something. According to a 2018 Pew report, black people represent 12% of the U.S. population, but 33%, that is a third of the prison population. Do you see any connections to these punishments in prison and what happens in schools? So far, I've argued that Brown was about the conflation, or after Brown, we saw a conflation or a mixing up of the ways in which discipline practices and punishment practices manifest in schools. Next, I attempt to show how the Brown decision was about the curriculum because it was about who gets to teach whom. I want to draw here from the work of Elliot Eisner And Eisner talks about 3 forms of the curriculum. And the curriculum is just what students have the opportunity to learn. Students experience a curriculum in the corridors of their hallway. They experience a curriculum in their homes. They also even experience a curriculum on the bus ride to and from school. The most obvious form of the curriculum is what's known as the explicit curriculum. So the explicit curriculum is the curriculum that we teach, and it's the curriculum that's written down. A second form of the curriculum is what's known as the implicit curriculum. And the implicit curriculum is not written down, but sometimes it's intentional and other times it isn't. So I was in a classroom, and a principal came over the intercom and asked the teacher to send 3 strong boys to the office to carry some books back to her classroom. Right? There is an implicit message embedded in that curriculum site. Does that make sense? And then the third form of the curriculum is what's known as the null curriculum. And the null curriculum is the most fascinating form of the curriculum because the null curriculum is what's not covered in schools. So I told you I spent a lot of time in preschool classrooms attempting to find the right fit for Anna and Elise. I was in a classroom once, and on this particular day, a little boy walked in with his mother, and his mother was wearing a red shirt, a red sweater. And so another little boy walked up and said, "Oh, your mom is wearing a red sweater." And the teacher said, "That's right. And yesterday we talked about the color." And red starts with the letter R. Great participation there, right? In the very same classroom, the next day or a few days later, another student walked in, and on this day, the student walked in with his 2 mommies. And a student walked up and said, "Oh, you have 2 mommies. I have a mommy and a daddy." And the teacher said, No. Go back into your center and play. Right? So there's a lesson embedded in that avoidance. In a very similar way, when we teach or we don't teach this, 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 or we don't teach this. Legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw has made it clear that while we know the names Philando Castile and Eric Garner and Michael Brown, we don't readily know the names of Melissa Williams and Alicia Thomas and Kendra James. And that's problematic in the grand scheme of how we think about disrupting injustice. And so my father drove a forklift for 38 and a half years, and he's not much of a phone talker. He talks to my mother. He says, tell Rich to get his oil changed. Right? And so he called me one day, and I was in the midst of teaching. And so when I saw his number come up on my caller ID, I stepped into the hallway, and I picked up the phone, and I said, "Hey, Pop, what's going on?" I was nervous, And he started talking mid-sentence. We got to teach him some phone etiquette, right? He started talking. He said, "If you get pulled over by the cops, you do exactly what you're told. You don't ask any questions." And I'm like, "Daddy, I haven't done anything, right?" And he said, "Because you're going to bury me. I'm not going to bury you," right? And so if my father is having that kind of conversation with me, can you imagine the kinds of conversations your students our parents are having with students in schools? I had flown into St. Louis, Missouri, to do a talk in Rockwood, Missouri. And I got a rental car, and so I was driving to my professional development session in Rockwood, Missouri. And as I was driving, I saw blue lights in my mirror. And so I got off the highway, and I was looking for, I don't know about you, but I could never find that registration that the rental car. So I was looking for this registration, but the blue lights passed me by. And so when I started back on the freeway, I broke down and I started crying. And I thought, what is wrong with me? Why am I crying? And what I realized in that moment is that I was experiencing what's known as vicarious trauma. And so even though some of your students or some of the students in our classrooms have not experienced firsthand situations related to violence, living in these bodies can precipitate the kinds of traumatic experiences that can have devastating effects. And so I asked Mr. Williams, I said, Mr. Williams, do you all, right after segregation, did you as educators, did you address issues of police violence and violence in general against black bodies in the classroom? And his response to me was that they really did not. And he said the reason they didn't was because the white superintendent would not hear it. I want to suggest that historically and currently, our absence, or the absence of addressing curricular opportunities that are germane to student success, that are germane to student healing, is a form of punishment. So we should think about the curriculum as a form of punishment when we don't provide spaces for students to unpack what's happening in society. Now, some will say, why is it, Rich, that we should talk about these issues of racial violence in the classroom? I have a real curriculum to teach. Let me tell you something. This is the real curriculum. This is the real curriculum. Have you ever been in a classroom where you felt disconnected from what is being taught? Or have you ever wondered why aspects of history, indigenous or diasporic knowledge, as educational researcher Cynthia Dillard described, were glanced over or completely absent from a curriculum? My point is, these racial situations can be linked to the real curriculum. The curriculum that teachers are supposed to teach, and at times to help students build their capacity to fight against racial injustice. What I've come to understand is that the more society and curriculum change, the more it seems that they stay the same. Finally, I want to share with you results from a survey that my colleagues Lori DeLaley O'Connor, Adam Alvarez, and Ira Murray developed in order to get a sense of teachers' reported beliefs about about whether they believe race should be germane to the curriculum. I had received calls, many calls, from the media after we saw a proliferation of an increase in the number of violent deaths against black people. And the first few calls, the reporters were asking me to provide examples of what teachers can do inside of the classroom to address these issues. And so the first few calls I actually took, and I tried to provide some suggestions and some ideas about what teachers could do in the classroom. And then eventually I said, I'm not taking any more of these calls because the question is whether teachers believe these issues are salient to what they should teach, right? So if teachers don't believe they should address issues of race, I can provide all the strategies in the book on how they might be able to address them. And so what we did was we developed a survey to gauge and get a sense of teachers' reported beliefs. There were 33 items, and I want to focus today on 3 of them. So on the question of whether teachers believed race was important, 86% of teachers reported that they believed race was important. And for me, this actually disconfirmed my conjecture or my hypothesis. I had thought that the percentage would be much lower because I used to spend a good amount of time when I was teaching students just trying to make the case that race was salient and important to the curriculum in my work. And so this stat was actually encouraging to me on a number of levels. The second question we posed was whether teachers felt prepared to talk about race. And you see of this same sample, the percentages dropped, right? So 45% of teachers actually did not feel prepared to do so, and 55% said that they did. And then 33% reported that they did not believe that they should address issues of racial violence with their students. Here's a breakdown of the racial background of the teachers themselves. I strongly encourage you to read the paper when the paper is published because I don't have a lot of time to go through it, but this gives you an example of the racial breakdown for question 2 and for the racial breakdown for question 3. And so I want to conclude with words and a call to action from Mr. Williams.
My years with Dr. King, I would like for you to know that. My brother, drove for him occasionally, and one day he carried him out to the airport, and Dr. King walked around. He said, I want me a drink of water. Back then, that time you had white and black. He went over to the white water fountain. Man, when I tell you, he said, nigga, y'all got a water fountain over there? I just wanted a drink of water. Then he got Lum and held up there and let him, man, just shaking his head at him. He was a brave guy, He would lead marches and do things where he knew he was going to be jailed, but he believed in that nonviolence, and he believed that would further the cause. And he just wasn't afraid to die. He believed in, he said that a man didn't believe in something so strong that he wouldn't die for it, then he wasn't fit to live. I mean, he really believed that, and he showed that in his life,
My friends and colleagues, we are talking about our children. They are the heartbeats of our future. We have a social and emotional responsibility to create systems and structures to ensure that our children have a fighting chance to maximize their capacity and their humanity. Like Mr. Williams and Dr. Martin Luther King, I hope you will be brave and strong enough to disrupt punitive policies and practices. Thank you.
Thank you. It's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Milner, for such a powerful and meaningful lecture. I kept thinking that if only your insights and findings had been woven into the Brown decision and its implementation, I believe we would be in a very different place today. You raised both ideas and challenges that we can address as a community of scholars, policymakers, and practitioners. Please join me in thanking Dr. Milner again.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now we're going to ask you to step into the living room. Thank you. And we'll move into the discussion portion of the evening. I invite our distinguished discussion forum participants to join Dr. Milner on stage in our living room set. We are pleased to have an excellent moderator. Emily Hanford is an award-winning education correspondent and producer for AMP Reports, the documentary and investigative journalism group at American Public Media. Emily has been working in public media for more than 2 decades as a reporter, producer, editor, news director, and program host. Her work has won numerous honors, including those from the Education Writers Association and the Associated Press. In 2017, she won the Excellence in Media Reporting on Education Research Award from AERA. Emily is joined by 2 distinguished commentators. who will discuss the relevance of the issues Dr. Milner raised to students, educators, and others across the country, and how they connect to areas of policy, program, and practice. I will now turn it over to Emily, who will briefly introduce our two commentators and begin our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
So we have, that was a wonderful talk, by the way, so thank you very much. I know that was a lot of work. You did a great job. Lots to talk about. So we have two distinguished guests here to respond for a few minutes to, we're going to be on a first-name basis here, to what Rich said. So Dr. Leslie Fenwick has taught students from kindergarten to the postdoctoral level. She's a former visiting fellow at Harvard, and she's the Dean Emerita of the Howard University School of Education, where she's currently a professor of education policy. And she is regularly called upon to testify about educational equity, college access, school leadership, and teacher quality and diversity. And she's also a great writer and contributes often in op-ed pieces and others to our national conversation about education and race and many other important issues. And we have Peter Schulman. Yes? Peter Schulman is the CEO, relatively recently, just about 6 months or so, right, of Urban Teachers, and he's going to tell us what Urban Teachers is all about in a moment. Previously, he worked in education at the state and district levels, most recently as Deputy Commissioner for the New Jersey Department of Education, and before that as a leader in the Delaware Department of Education and in the Miami-Dade County Public Schools. Thank you for being here. So we're going to hear from Pete first.
Great. Thank you, Emily. And I'd like to start by first thanking Rich and Amy and Felice and everyone for having me. Really a privilege to be up here to discuss such an important set of issues. And as a little bit of context, I thought I'd talk for a moment about Urban Teachers, but then thinking about how I weave in my current work that I'm doing into Rich's dialogue. Certainly just as a sort of moment of personal privilege, having worked as a district administrator, having worked as a state policymaker, and now working with a nonprofit that prepares practitioners, the issues cut across all of these areas, and the complexity of these issues, I think, cannot be overstated. So Urban Teachers is a nonprofit that is a joint venture with Johns Hopkins University that we believe is the most rigorous, culturally competent training program for urban teachers in America. We've been around for about 9 years, and we work in Baltimore, DC, and Dallas. We train teachers in a 4-year model. The first year of the model is actually a 14-month initial year, if you will. It's an immersive residency-based model where new teachers are trained side by side in the classrooms alongside the children that they will serve. The following 3 years of our program, they are a full-time teacher of record while finalizing their pursuit of their master's degree from Johns Hopkins and their full state certification. When Rich said earlier that he would place his best bet on teachers, I agree, 100%. So certainly, in my roles, both at the district level and the state level, and as we think about different revolving doors of policies and conversations around standards and assessments and accountability, we're never going to disintermediate the need for great teachers, especially for underserved kids. And as we look around teacher preparation in this country and how we invest or lack thereof in preparation and what it means for teachers, especially in urban and rural areas, to be learner ready day one, this is a huge opportunity we can improve on as a country. And I'm not going to say that Urban Teachers has cracked the nut, but I will say that I believe we're trending in the right direction. So as we think about the 3 issues that Rich spoke about, I don't see them as mutually exclusive, and I think that was the point of the Venn diagram showing how much they do overlap. Within our work, I'd like to talk about sort of from 3 areas. So first is around selection. So as we think about the idea of having teachers that reflect the students they serve, only 2% of our educators are black males. In Baltimore, DC, and Dallas, 95% of the students we serve are black or Latino. So right there, you can just understand the quick math there. We have a huge need that we're not fulfilling. And part of what we do at Urban Teachers, we make it our mission to ensure that, to the best of our ability, we're finding minority candidates to put in front of underserved children that best reflect them. And we're doing so not because we think it's a good idea, or Rich believes it's a good idea, or even Mr. Williams speaks about it. The research now supports it. So as you look at Constance Lindsay's research around this, having only one black teacher in elementary school can dramatically reduce by up to 40%. Well, I was going to call them exclusionary discipline, but now I'll call them punishments because I'm trying to be a quick learner, Rich.
That's what they are.
Reduce punishments by 40%. That's just one teacher, right? Not even multiple teachers in a consecutive fashion, but this really matters. She found the same thing to be true in Tennessee data. So this is something that's not something that we always known, maybe in our moral compass is pointing us the way. The data and the research now supports it. So for us, the identification, the selection of who we're going to put in front of children really, really matters. We put a lot of time into it. Number two, in terms of actually preparing them. So as we think about our own curriculum, we want to make sure that our folks who are going through our program are really wrestling and tackling these issues of race and equity. I do realize the dissonance, though, because when they're placed, whether it be in D.C., Baltimore, or Dallas, they're subject to the curriculum and the standards of that state or of that district. And understanding what that sort of dichotomy looks like is something we certainly struggle with. But I will say that, in an earlier work, Rich, I'm going to give a quote which I think you'll be familiar with because I believe you were the author of it. But quite often, teachers enter classrooms secretly afraid because they have never known anyone who looked, talked, or acted like them, right? And the idea of making a learner-ready teacher day one for an urban environment means you need to understand the students you're serving and spend time with them. And the importance of a residency-based model is you're going to have 14 months of having exposure. And for certain folks, especially who are Caucasian, who haven't been around children of color, this is essential. It's not exhaustive, but it is certainly essential in our mind. And then for us, we want to be a learning organization, and we really want to think about what our supports mean in terms of specifically equity. So as we've gotten into this work and been there for 10 years, again, I've only been there for 6 months, there's certain lessons we've learned. We've learned that some of our entry requirements were obstacles, and they were disproportionately affecting black male candidates from getting into our program. And what were the supports we were going to do to address those obstacles? We then looked at HBCUs to figure out what are the mentoring tactics that they use, and why don't we employ some of them with our folks to make sure in that first year of being a full-time teacher of record, we're giving them the right coaching and support. And then lastly, as we think about our own professionalism standards, realizing do they come from a point of white privilege, right? Are they through a very narrow lens where implicit bias can seep through? So these are things that we're continuing to learn about, but this work is really hard, it's really difficult, and you really need to pay attention to it because our kids deserve it. So with that, I'll sort of let and pass to Leslie, and she can sort of piggyback maybe.
Sounds good.
Great.
So Felice, I echo Peter's remarks about being delighted about being here. Amy, thank you as well. And Rich, thank you so much for very thought-provoking and honest conversation and research. Even though we're in the living room, I do have a few notes because you gave us a lot to digest. I want to make sure I cover 3 points that are explicitly related to your research. First, the story you share about your journey to find your daughters a school that was academically rigorous and not debilitating to their racial identity and wholeness is meaningful. And I understand that journey, and I understand that story. It's one that I saw my parents engage when I was a child for me and my 4 brothers. It's a journey that my 3 brothers and their wives, who have 7 children between them, continue today. And it's a journey that I've witnessed as a teacher and a principal. It's real, and guess what? And you know this, it's a tiresome journey. The tiresomeness of this journey is shared by African American parents, whether they're college educated and more affluent or not. This seesaw of being, confronted with the prospect of bartering between academic rigor and a non-racially hostile and affirming environment should not be part of the bargain of our children's schooling and education. And I call this the barter effect. I note that your experiences, Rich, and our family's experiences are also reflected in the national data. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES, fewer black parents, 46%, than white parents, 64%, report being very satisfied with their child's school. And their dissatisfaction is tied to the racialization of school climate and school quality. It's about that barter effect. So I just appreciate the story as the framing for your research, because it's honest and it's true, and it's borne out in qualitative and quantitative research, and is something that I think we as teachers and administrators and preparers of future educators really need to continue to work around. The second point is that I'm really, really intrigued with your conversation about the curriculum and how it can cultivate practices of punishment and perpetuate inequality. You made me start thinking about what I believe is a five-fold problem. First, I think about Akua's work that says that no curriculum can proceed without the restoration of identity. And certainly that was a theme in your work, that identity restoration and protection for children of color is essential, is like an essential foundation to the curriculum. But I think that there's this five-fold problem that we in this room can address, whether we're policymakers or researchers or preparers of the next generation of educators or educators ourselves. And this is the five-fold problem that you allude to, that the curriculum that almost all of the nation's school children experience is still pretty much exclusively white in authorship, white in content, white in imagery, and white in delivery. And the core of psychometricians, and there are those of us in this room who are psychometricians, developing the standardized tests to test the curriculum and children's capacity and knowledge, is also nearly exclusively white. So clearly we need more diversity in the groups that are developing curricula and developing assessments, or we'll continue around, thank you for that, and we're going to continue on this hamster wheel, okay? Educationally malnourishing children, stigmatizing them and expecting them to achieve is not smart. The last point I wanted to make is that there are states and districts that are making progress on breaking down these barriers that disconnected curricula pose to student learning. I want us to think about, for instance, Tucson, Arizona Public Schools back in 2002 in an effort to raise Hispanic and Latinx student graduation rates. The district experimented with La Raza studies and then created a number of other ethnic studies programs. And the experiment worked. And Hispanic Latinx students' graduation rates went from 54% to 93%. The experiment worked. The experiment worked. But the district's ethnic studies programs were discontinued in 2011 and labeled un-American and divisive by state and district leaders, not by outsiders, by state and district leaders. And this point relates to your teacher statistics. Rich, educators of color are also underrepresented in the principalship and the superintendency. Where there are no educators of color in the classroom, there won't be any leading schools or districts. Only about 17% of the nation's 93,000 principals are African American or Hispanic Latinx, and less than 6% of the nation's 14,000 superintendents are Black or Hispanic Latinx. And this is so even though Black educators are the nation's most academically credentialed and experienced, even though Black educators are the nation's most academically credentialed and experienced. Well, Florida is one of 4 states that has made an explicit effort to confront the hegemony of the school curriculum by passing an actual law, State Statute 1003.42, that requires the teaching of the history of African Americans and African peoples prior to the enslavement experience, along with the contributions of African Americans to society. And the law also requires instructional materials reflect the contributions of African Americans to American societies. But Florida is only one of 4 states that passed this into law. And that law was really crafted largely by Black educators who collaborated with white legislators. And it asserts that education equity, just as your research indicates, education equity, it's got to be tied to a representative curriculum and instructional materials. So I'll stop there because I see the done sign. And,
keep going.
Keep going. But thank you for giving us a lot to digest and think about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you, all of you. So I'm going to open up with a couple of questions, but the main event here is questions from all of you. So there are a couple of microphones, and you can start lining up if you want to at the microphones, and we will call on you. I'm a reporter, so I ask a lot of questions, but actually your talk made me think of just this one anecdote that I wanted to tell about my own experience, not really my experience as a reporter, but so 86% of teachers say that teaching race is a good idea, and it doesn't surprise me that much. It's kind of the right answer to that question, you know? But then do they really know how to do it? And of course, they don't. Even the black teachers, I mean, it's surprising that there's not a lot of confidence about addressing this in the classroom, especially from white teachers, but from all teachers. And I think one of the things that's really important to think about in terms of that is the null curriculum. I really love that idea of like the null curriculum. Just what are we avoiding, and then what messages do we send to children when we avoid things? And while I think the idea of mandating certain things is really important, I think one of the reasons why the mismatch between the teachers and the students in our schools, 2% black men, almost 80% of the teachers in our schools are white women. Okay, and then more than half of the kids are kids of color. So I think the way that this mismatch plays out is this little scene that I saw in a 4th grade classroom in Philadelphia a couple of years ago, where I was doing a story about the lack of black men in teaching and why are there so few of them. And it was a black male teacher, Mr. Hayes, and they were having a conversation about a book. And this little boy named Kassir just started kind of talking. He kind of was talking about a lot of things that weren't quite germane to the conversation. But it came up sort of as part of the conversation that he had had this kind of experience with the police. He'd been riding his bike in the park, and the police were starting to chase him or something. And the other kids kind of chimed in and said, yeah. They put their siren on, and they were chasing him. And there was this conversation. And Mr. Hayes took that. He didn't, stopped the conversation, and they talked about it for a little while. And the really moving thing is that Mr. Hayes kind of ended it all by giving them basically a piece of advice. He's like, I just want you to know that I get pulled over by the police, and when I do, I make sure that I pull out my school ID first. Whoops, officer, sorry, here's my license. Which is like, I'm a teacher. And he hopes that that's going to protect him. Anyway, that just little piece of advice that went to those 4th graders, first of all, that he didn't ignore it, that they had a conversation, and they had something to say about it that was really practical and could really be of use to the children in this class. And so that's why I think the color of the teachers in our classrooms matter for so many reasons, but that's one of them. So anyway, so my first question actually is sort of about that. So this idea that Brown was about curriculum because it was about who teaches whom, that's a really interesting idea. And you laid out one of the sort of cruel irony's not really the right word, ironies of the Brown decision, implications of the Brown decision, the loss of all these black teachers. I think almost 40,000 teachers in the decade after Brown lost their jobs or were moved into lower positions. High school principals became middle school principals. People went down to the elementary schools. So I hope we're going to talk more in the Q&A about efforts to get more black teachers into our classrooms. But one thing that I think we should talk about is how you keep black teachers in classrooms, because when you look at the data, what you see is really high turnover among black teachers, higher than among anyone else, especially black men. So we could do this great job of bringing in more black teachers, but for some reason they're leaving our schools. So we've talked a lot about the implications of all of this for students, but what is going on in our schools that we're not attracting enough black teachers into teaching, and then when we do attract them, we lose them at higher rates than other teachers? Thoughts on that? What's up in our schools that it's not a good place for black teachers to work?
One of the things I would say here is the idea that, of course, we want to make sure that we are operating from a structural perspective through an equity lens, right? And so we spend a lot of time talking about or thinking that if we provide mechanisms or support spaces for black teachers or black male teachers, that we do, necessarily for other teachers from other racial and ethnic backgrounds, that somehow they're going to persist or remain in the field. I think we have to really think seriously about the reality that Black teachers are experiencing deep levels of injustice, racism. They're grappling with and working through helping their students work through situations that are related, that are race related. So I'm thinking about your story about the fourth grader, right? One point that the teacher also could have made was, and you're also read as a Black body, right? And so your being read by a Black body is also important, and really helping them think about, in a developmentally appropriate way, how to navigate and negotiate that space as well. And so, I always say, like, we find funds and resources to do just about anything we really want to do if we want to do them. Like this notion that we don't know what to do, I don't buy, right? Mm-hmm. We have good science, right? So, because teachers are, and I'll answer your question, so because teachers are working overtime, right, with the burden, Fannie Lou Hamer said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? Mm-hmm. Then, provide mechanisms and support systems and pay them a stipend, give them opportunities to go and recharge themselves. And it might be inconsistent with what happens and what shows up for other teachers as well. So, my point is that we've got to think seriously about not only Black male teachers, but teachers of color in general, and provide mechanisms and support systems from an equity frame in terms of being responsive.
Absolutely.
Well, go ahead. Of course, Leslie.
So you look at these, you reference these statistics about who's reaching children in this tremendous demographic mismatch. So 91% of urban school teachers are white, and you think about the composition of the student population they're serving, and then go inside inner city rings. So urban center, 91% go into the inner city ring. You have about 73% of teachers are white, and 68% of principals are white in these highly diverse settings. So the school personnel and the student population, tremendous demographic mismatch. And so why does any of this matter? Well, we know from the research, as Peter said, and as Rich has already told us, that 4 outcomes avail to African American and Hispanic Latinx students when they're in highly diverse schools, staffed and that are staffed by a highly diverse workforce. 1, they're more likely to graduate high school in 4 years. 2, they're more likely to be recommended for gifted education. 3, they're less likely to be misplaced in special education. And 4, they're less likely to be corporally or any other way punished. Not that any states still have corporal punishment. I started teaching when there were states that still had corporal punishment.
I think 17 states still.
7 states still do.
Yes.
Yes.
Wow. I remember working in a school in Ohio where there was a 92% request for transfer rate among the teachers. The teaching body was nearly 100% white. The student body was 550 K through 6th graders, exclusively Black. The school had become poor, and it was commonplace for teachers to meet students at the door with a paddle. In fact, when I was new to that school, I was told this was how we welcome the students. You stand at the door and you have a paddle in your hand. And so this idea that you're talking about, the assault that Black teachers are under, witnessing the behavior, witnessing what Black children are the recipient of, is reverberates with our own experiences growing up as those Black children in schools where there's this demographic mismatch. Now, I'm not, and I don't think any of us are advocating for the race matching of children and teachers. This is America, we don't do that. But what we are saying is that there are some reasons that African American teachers stay in schools as the percentage of children who are poor increases and the percentage of children who are racial, ethnic, or linguistic minorities increases. So we have a resource in these Black teachers who are committed to these environments I think because they resonate with their own experiences. And so when I hear the statistic about Black teachers leaving the profession, I'm encouraged by them coming to the profession with an intention to remain in schools even as the poverty level and the diversity of those schools increase. And I worry about the toll that it takes on teachers to negotiate what they're observing children experience and then their own professional kind of growth and vulnerability in these settings. And many of those settings are very transient settings. You know, I was in a school, 92% of the teachers were requesting out of that school. I have my own ideas about why that was so, and it wasn't because the children were intimidating and violent. There were no guns back in the 80s when I was teaching in the schools where I taught. So your work is really, you know, massaging this in a way that I think initially is uncomfortable to talk about, but we need to push through this veil to go to the next level if we're going to serve children well.
Yeah.
It's going to take a push. That we can all agree on. So Richard Ingersoll put out a research paper, I think 7 days ago. He's one of the foremost authorities on teacher attrition, and it's sort of an update to what he'd done in the early 2000s. And he did say, again, optimistically, we're getting more minorities into the profession, but they're leaving at even a higher rate. So right now, 50% of all teacher attrition happens within 25% of our school districts, primarily in our urban environments. The work is really hard, so we don't want to make sure we sort of contextualize this and saying, look, for all teachers, this is really difficult. I certainly think that there are, and I think, Rich, you were alluding to this, there are structural reasons why, right? Not just in terms of what we're seeing in the communities, but in terms of how we think about the education system, how we allocate dollars, what are we using to attract folks, what are we doing to retain folks. Absolutely, those things need to be revisited and how we reposition our dollars potentially and reposition our resources. But I do go back to this idea of preparation. As you look at other vocations and the rigor and the expectations that it takes to succeed in medicine, in law, in accounting, in plumbing, in electricians, you name it, there's a lot more advanced apprenticeships, there's a lot more immersive experiences. We can't expect someone who's had a month or two of clinical experience to go into an urban environment and think that they're going to understand the realities of that classroom. It doesn't seem to work.
I think we also have to talk about how we select principals for
Yes.
schools that are high poverty.
Yes,
and high
yes,
minority.
yes.
So it absolutely is a tale of two cities. It's absolutely a tale of two cities. More affluent communities, there's more parental input. There's an expectation that the principal is going to be highly qualified, successful, and stable. And you look at that same process unfold in less affluent schools that serve more students of color, and the principal who's been a failure elsewhere, or the principal who's a novice is appointed to school A, but never school B.
Yep.
And this is part of the narrative that Black teachers are witnessing and observing along with Black parents who are serving in these schools. That's an injustice, that I'm in a school where my principal has had no experience, or my principal has been demoted from the north side of the district and plopped here because there's an expectation that this will do, that this is enough. There's another structural piece to this, that there are some schools that have been identified as places where faculty can get married and have babies, and it doesn't matter if there's a churn around the teacher force in that school, because when they finish getting married and having babies, if that's what they do, they go on to a more stable school setting. And I mention that story because it was a narrative that my youngest brother learned when he became a teacher and was assigned to a school that was the poorest school and the blackest school in a district in Virginia. And he noticed that the white female teachers who came out of the local teacher college came to that school and commonly talked about in the teacher lounge at lunchtime, oh, I'm getting married, we're going to have our baby, and then I go to Acme Elementary School. And so this is uncomfortable to say because it sounds like I'm demonizing white teachers and white principals and young people who are growing, but I'm not. I'm trying to pull away this veil and talk about, as you do through the research lens, what's really happening in these schools. And there are multiple layers. Remember, the research tells us, too, that 60% of student achievement can be attributable to teacher quality, but there's 40% that we haven't talked about, okay? And that's an uncomfortable conversation, too. But I think part of the structural conversation has to be these deep-rooted conversations that peel back the layers of what's really happening in schools and what's really being cultivated in schools that serve poor Black and brown children.
So I have one more question, and I hope you all have some questions. Please start lining up at the microphones. I'm sure you do. You know, one of the things I think that's also really important in this conversation is that Black teachers are really good for white students, too. And we really need to remember that. And I think what the data shows about why the attrition rate is so high among Black teachers is that Black teachers do often choose and want to end up working in some of the toughest schools, and they're on a mission, they want to work there. And what they find is everyone who works in those schools finds that you can't work in those schools for very long, that it really burns you out, and the white teachers are having their babies and going off to other places, and a lot of the Black teachers are finding other professions. And, you know, that's really sad. So there's something that's hard on all teachers in our high poverty schools, and we need to fix that. And we just need to create conditions for good people to do good work. So I think what we really do need to do is have more teachers of color in our schools and retain them. But even if we're not going to change it very quickly, we got about close to 80% of the teachers are white women. So we do have to think about what to do there. Like, what do we do, you know, what do we know about how white teachers can become better teachers of kids of color? Because that's our reality and it's not going to change anytime soon. What do we know about that?
I would say, I mean, within our cohorts, 54% are candidates of color, 46% are Caucasian. And, you know, this is, again, over the last 9 years, really honing our own curriculum, really looking ourselves in the mirror, and really, and I think this part, and I think Leslie was alluding to this, being a partner with the district you serve, not thinking that you know within your preparation space what is best for the kids in West Baltimore, understanding what they're going through and what are the needs of that classroom in that school in that community, and really trying to make sure that we think about higher ed and K-12 as true partners in this, and realizing it can't be done sort of at a theoretical level. You know, my sense is these are big investments, and sort of changes the way in saying that we're going to churn out teachers and sort of figure out where they go. It's make sure they're prepared, making sure there's a true level of placement and support, and continuing to support them. Because I think, as you were mentioning, the work is really hard, without question.
Rich, you know, a lot of us cheered when you put that slide up about HBCUs. And I saw Howard there in the corner. That was a good you know, we have a cheer, HU. You know. But I am going to say that you know that HBCUs are less than 3% of the nation's colleges and universities, but we prepare 50% of the nation's Black teachers. So if HBCUs disappeared tomorrow, we would lose 50% of the nation's African American teachers. And there are 2 HSIs, Hispanic Serving Institutions, that prepare 90% of the nation's Hispanic Latino teachers. So there's a model of preparation, I think, that these institutions have as the foundation of their preparation programs that help students stick and stay and refine their mission to serve in contexts that are resource challenged. And we know in a capitalist society, if there's a challenge to the resource base, there are other fractures and fissures as well. So I thought one of the recommendations of your paper about investing in HBCUs and HSIs as engines of innovation is really, really important, because what I find, especially during my years here in DC, is the money is going to institutions that have a far less robust track record of producing successful Black, brown teachers who stick and stay. So this investment with our money matters. And to Peter's point, there are a lot of African American men who desire to be teachers. We had a program funded for $2.1 million at Howard University by the U.S. Department of Education called Ready to Teach. We partnered with 5 urban areas. We had 1,000 applicants for essentially 100 slots.
Wow.
And these were high caliber applicants. And it just reaffirmed that there are individuals out there who can contribute to the field if given the opportunity. Jackie Irvine's work, Cultures, done back in the 80s and 90s, is still relevant to how do we take white students, pre-service teachers who have the desire to reach their students. There's no one who goes into teaching who doesn't want to reach his or her or their students, and I think her Cultures work is still relevant. And then I think, too, this is the last thing I would say, the nation has a wonderful resource right in our backyard here in Washington, D.C., the new Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture is a resource to teachers and students. Many of those resources have been digitized, so teachers don't have to be here in D.C. to use what's there. And the museum asserts what our curricula do not yet assert, which is that blacks have made a contribution to the intellectual, cultural history of this country. The contribution is not only cultural, it's intellectual. And so I think that we have a place where we can get traction. That museum, if you go there, you have content knowledge. Teachers, black, white, Hispanic, Latinx, Asian, are aching for the content. Tell me how to teach mathematics so that it's culturally relevant. I don't believe that the teachers who are out there, the 80% who are white females, are saying, no, don't tell me, I don't want to reach my children. I don't want to know how mathematics is culturally relevant. I think that would be an outlier group. So we have a resource now, and we have an intention, and I think we just need to continue traction on the will to make this so. These children who are at the edges of the social, economic, political, educational order are going to be the majority. The demographers say by 2044. I say 2024. So what will it mean for American democracy? What will it mean for public education to have these children who are on the edges of the social, economic, and political order now, the majority later? We have to address this issue, and we have to have the uncomfortable conversations to get us there. And I think that HBCUs are a repository of models and knowledge and history and lessons about how to do this and go forward well.
We have to make sure they can all vote.
Yes. Oh my.
That they can and that they do. Okay, so we have some questions. So will you do you have a question?
Yes.
Yes. Will you tell us who you are and then give us your question?
Well, first, Rich, excellent man. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us. Yeah, my name is Charles Rankin, and I've spent 50 years doing what he's been talking about. I've been in the school business for 50 years. I retired June the 15th of this year. And I have a buddy, Hank, down there from Gainesville, and I keep telling him I've lived too long because I see stuff happening in this country that I never dreamed would happen in America. Never dreamed it. I'm from a little town in Kansas, and this room is full of people who know how to educate kids. I see them all over, my friends, they're dedicated to it. And if we don't help these young people, we're all in deep, the rest of the word is called doo-doo, And because of that is that we need to address how teacher preparation takes place, because there's no failure if you're a lousy teacher. Doctors bury their mistakes, teachers educate theirs, And we've got to talk about what is necessary to train folks to work with folks. These kids are not going away. They need our help. They need our commitment. They need our professionality to be able to teach them how to be the American dream, to be all they can be. And so my question to you, Rich, and those on the panel, is what can you do in teacher education with the 42% that are here now, and it's going to be 50% in about 10 years that are coming through the school, because you have to go to school. You know, it's two things you got to do: pay taxes, die, and go to school. You know, and we have to change how we prepare young people to educate people. You know, we know how to do that. One thing about HBCs: teach, preach, and mortuary science. They're masters of the game. They are. They're excellent at it. I agree with you. Excellent. So please, somebody respond. How we can change teacher education 2018 to educate the 53% minority kids who are in the public schools today out of the 55 million. 84% are white females. We got to change.
Yeah.
We got to change.
So one of the things I would say, Charles, is that the people who prepare, the teacher educators themselves, I think, need time and they need professional development themselves. I think quite often what happens is the people preparing teachers are excellent at their work and at their interactions with pre-service teachers and in-service teachers and so forth. But their capacity to study and design learning opportunities for teachers, I think, is sometimes not where it needs to be, because they're teaching 4 or 5 classes and they're serving on so many committees, and right. So in other words, I think we really must bolster and enhance the research component of the clinical experiences in teacher education, because when we do that, we can replicate and transfer innovation, I think, beyond individual teacher education programs. The second thing I would offer is, at the University of Pittsburgh, one of the things we did was through the Center for Urban Education, we worked with the State Department, and we asked the State Department to consider an endorsement or certificate. And when my colleagues and I took the proposal to the State Department, we thought we were going to get a lot of pushback or that they were going to create obstacles that were unattainable. And what we found was the State Department said, you're absolutely right. We must do a better job of preparing teachers to go into urban environments. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to create an endorsement or a certificate that would be recognized throughout the Commonwealth. I think those kinds of moves, and so what the University of Pittsburgh ended up having to do, what we were doing was we worked with Temple and Drexel in order to advance an agenda that might be recognized. I think if we continue doing our work in silos, if we continue doing and educating, drawing from innovation from HBCUs and other institutions, without getting the knowledge out, without disseminating the knowledge beyond our individual teacher education programs, especially when we think about issues of racial justice, right? I think we're going to find ourselves in a holding pattern for a while. So the issues are out now, right? So we're being very clear about the fact that we believe that that teachers need to know their content. We'll have a robust knowledge base related to their content, but we're also saying that they need to be racially literate, that they need to be racially just in their practices, right? And they have to value the children. So the education piece, I think, is important to build the knowledge base.
So here's what I'm going to do, because we're blessed with lots of people who want to ask questions. So I'm going to go to the questions. Please tell us who you are and ask your question pretty quickly, and we're going to try to go through this sort of rapid fire. So if you're dying to say something, you might just have to weave it in later. So go ahead.
That's us, I guess. Hello, my name is Shelby Dawkins Law. I'm a PhD student at the University of Pittsburgh in the Center for Urban Education. And we miss you, Dr. Milner. My question is about the null curriculum, and I'm thinking about this word preparation that all of you have said many times, And I'm thinking about what aren't we teaching when we frame teacher education as teacher preparation. Because for me, preparation implies being scared. And if you think about the fear, like it reminds me of test prep, how afraid I was of test prep. And the first time I was taught to be afraid of tests was in first grade at a public school here in DC. So if you think of children as being something to be scared of, schools as something to be scared of to work in, are we just reinforcing this idea that I've come to learn about of just the plantation politics of the schools that we're sending our children to, that we're sending our teachers to? Because if we think of ourselves as being pre-service, in-service, whatever that may be, that to me sounds like the military. And if all of that is kind of combining into this greater idea of just schools as violence. So I'm not sure where my question ends, but just something about the word preparation is bothering me right now.
So moving from teacher preparation to teacher education, or what's the difference between those two things?
Is it a problem?
Is it a problem?
Yeah, it's a problem, and you articulated it very well. And maybe this is your research. I don't know if we have an answer to this, but I will say this. I will say this, that every predicate to education is cultural identity, right? Okay. And we're not saying that the cultural identity of African American children is different in terms of a conceptual notion than any other child. When you look at current curricular materials, everything is aimed at the cultural identity restoration and acceleration of white children in schools. That's the curriculum, the authorship, the content, the imagery. So maybe there's a word around how we prepare our teachers that we can talk about relative to the restoration of cultural identity for children who've been left out of this conversation in their classroom textbooks, in the imagery in the classroom, in the notion that they are repositories of intellectual ability and giftedness. Maybe there's some way to language that I don't know, but since you raised the question, you can language.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on to another question, and then this is all good follow-up for the reception afterwards, so you can weigh in. So yes, tell us who you are and what your question is.
Hi there, my name is Rachel Feldman. I am the AERA AAAS Congressional Fellow this year. And my question is that we have been talking about who the teachers are and their preparation and focusing on the teachers. And as we know, they are of primary importance in teaching our children. But they operate in a larger system. And I'm curious if you could just spend a couple of moments talking about the impact of that system and how you think that is impacting who these teachers are and how their experiences are shaped. Thank you.
Sure. Having worked at the systems level, both at a big district and the state, I mean, certainly when we think about teachers, teacher prep specifically, if we're using that word still, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. So as we think about what the teaching profession looks like and what it means to be an attractive vocation, certainly there's conversations about what the curriculum looks like, what the narrowing of curriculum looks like, what accountability looks like. I think there's certainly a discussion of what the broader ecosystem is, but I'll say this, is that to move to a smaller grain size, I think the real research has to come around what are the localized conditions for success. So you mentioned the experience of the principal. What is the right set of ingredients to actually support a novice teacher in an urban school district and give them the right set of supports, a lattice of supports, if you will? And is it that right principal with the right AP, instructional coaches, TAs, powers? I'm not sure. A cluster of novice teachers together. We've been experimenting a little of this, but I don't think there's been a near degree of a sense of body of research to figure out what are those ingredients that work together. Because too often what we do in education is we look for the one thing, and then we run that multivariate regression analysis to say, here's that one thing, can we prove it? When I actually think it's a confluence, if not a compound set of factors. And that's my own sense.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Irene Gomez, and I'm with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute as an education fellow. And I've noticed in DC that I rarely hear discussions about curriculum in education policy spaces. So my question for the panelists is what resources and research can education nonprofits and think tanks contribute to help develop more culturally sustaining curricula?
I mentioned there were 4 states that have done this work of placing in the law this requirement that the curriculum and instructional materials reflect some cultural relevancy. And I think studying those states and what they've done and attempting to have your state, I know you're in DC right now, but to have other states follow suit would be very helpful. We should have all 50 states doing this work. Akua did a wonderful study about the state of Florida and their statute, and I think the statute itself can be replicated. The issue in Florida about the implementation of the statute is resources. So there's an unevenness in the implementation, but there was support for the passage of the legislation. I would study that legislation and how it came to be in the various states.
Could I just build on that? So I came most recently from New Jersey, and we had an appointed commission called the Amistad Commission, which had developed a curriculum. And I went through the curriculum. It's pretty impressive. And first of all, not being well resourced, not necessarily being implemented. And I think the overarching point for me is there's something sad about it. It has to be legislated top down, right? Why are we not thinking about this? Why are there not more consortiums of schools and districts working together and saying, this is what we need for our kids? Because curriculum, again, such a touchy subject of who should be developing it, and certainly in my mind, the classroom teacher certainly knows best.
And in fact, in Florida, it was educators who worked
That's
grassroots
great.
up
That's
to the
fabulous.
legislators to get it going forward. I think Akua's research about the life of that policy is very, very
Yes, I
instructive.
didn't know that. I'm sorry.
No. I was just adding to. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nia Chloe Bowman, and I'm a current student at Babson College. And currently, I'm developing my thesis about the implications of school closures and how that affects brown and black students in urban cities. So my question to you is that I believe it was Leslie who mentioned that 60% of teacher quality is really attributable to student achievement, but we haven't talked about the other 40%. So I'm curious to know, what exactly do you feel the 40% that isn't being talked about that contributes a lot to student failures and overall school closures and failures altogether?
Well, thank you for that question. Yes, I was citing some research that said that 60% of the variance in student achievement is tied to teacher quality, teacher credentialing, in fact. The other 40%, I would say, is probably a confluence of, individual capacity and family support and community support. I think that many children are experiencing difficulty because of protracted joblessness in their communities, and when families are not economically stable, their residence where they live is not stable, and that impacts children. We have about 50 years of research that says that when the heads of households, whether they're male or female, have economic security, it helps children's social, academic, psychological development and stability. So I think there's a large issue around joblessness and how it has impacted multiple generations in a family, and you can see the devastation there. The closing of schools in urban communities, I believe, is tied to gentrification. And I wrote a piece that the Post published saying that urban school reform is about land development, not kids. And so I think, analysis of that truth is important. There's a wonderful book, The Color of School Reform, that many folks have read. One of my doctoral students who's in the audience right now, Jabriah Lewis, is doing a dissertation about how, I think you'll find this interesting, Rich, how African American middle-income parents are negotiating school choice and racial identity as they maneuver kind of this labyrinth around gentrification that is largely led by a white narrative or a white privileged narrative. So the school closures, I think, are tied to land development, gentrification, and that's a conversation that's not about school quality or equity, in my opinion.
One of the things I would add is that I think we can learn a lot from the field of social work, and in terms of how we think about the preparation of teachers. And colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh were working on this problem. The dean of the School of Social Work and the School of Education were talking about a joint program to educate and to prepare teachers. I'm sorry, I used the word prepare again.
Stuck there.
But to think about the education of teachers. And so when you think about the sociological challenges that we face inside of school, really that social work lens could really, I think, bolster the capacity of teachers.
Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Darren Fleischer. I'm a education policy doctoral student at George Washington University. You mentioned Philando Castile. He was a lunch service staff worker at a school. I'm actually doing my dissertation on support staff at schools, the lunch ladies, bus drivers, and they're very rarely part of the education policy conversation. So they are more likely to come from the communities, look like the children, sound like the children, speak their language. So I just want to get your sense on if you've observed schools that successfully integrate them, working with teachers, working with students, what your thoughts on that would be. So thank you.
I'm thinking several things, and congratulations on your research. I'm thinking about my experience at the University of Virginia as a teacher education student, and how in my 4 years of college I had no black faculty at UVA, and how when I walked across the campus, the individuals who were encouraging to black students were the maintenance staff. Okay? What are you doing? Are you late for class? These kind of things that you would hear in the environment. And so I said that was my personal experience. That's not, I don't know if, is research personal experience? That's my personal experience.
Me-search.
It's me-search.
There's no research on it. That's why
I've talked to a
keep
lot
saying
of students who have
that
talked
have
about that.
yeah.
That like one of the really important people at their community college or in their high school was the security guard, was maintenance person, was the lunch lady, because they're the people who live in the community.
So I had a me-search moment as well. And I thought this was a very, there are, the Teachers Union in New Jersey has county roundtables, which they host at night, and I used to go because we discuss everything from teacher evaluation and what have you. And there was one county that always brought in all of the support staff, including the bus driver. And I remember specifically one teacher says to the bus driver, "Don't get confused. You are a teacher. You're the first teacher the kids see in the morning." And we talked about how important that was in setting the tone for the day and understanding what those kids need. And you know, the bus driver at that point went on and just talked about her experience. So I love that you're doing this research. I think it has not been studied enough, and I'd be really curious to see what you learn.
Absolutely.
I think the power dynamics, too, are going to be interesting, because one of the subtexts of my experience at the University of Virginia, and this happens to children, remember 40%, almost 40% of the nation's public schools have no teacher of color. So what is that teaching children of color about who owns knowledge generation, who owns creativity, who is the repository of intellect, who is the authority? So even though I think this conversation needs to be broadened to the community, the village of individuals who support children, we still have to be really mindful about what they're learning in one of those curricula that Rich just taught us about. That is not, that is, it's implicit, the implicit curriculum.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Michelle Johnson, and I am a first-year principal at a bilingual public charter school here in DC, and I'm here with a couple of teachers from my school. And Leslie, I was very struck and affirmed in your conversations around Black leaders in schools. And I've been grappling a lot with what that means to be a victim of racial trauma and being charged with facilitating the development of cultural competency amongst your staff, and what that means to see children who are impacted, who could very well be my family and my nieces, and the composure that you have when you're emotionally triggered by what you're experiencing and facilitating. So I appreciate you acknowledging that, and I'm very selfishly asking for your wisdom and guidance on sustaining my role as a Black leader in a diverse setting, and what that means to care for self, and also be really clear on what is my work as a Black educator in the racialized world in which we live, and what's the work of others, and how to delineate that.
Thank you. And
Great question.
So you know where I live, right? We're here in DC. I've heard so many Black principals in particular, and teachers, use the language of guerrilla warfare, that they're behind enemy lines. And you cringe at the notion of warfare and guerrilla warfare, but it's speaking to this barter effect. You're bartering if you have children who are children of color. You're bartering if you're a teacher of color. You're bartering if you're a principal. Constantly bartering. How do I either deliver or ensure my children receive an academically rigorous program that doesn't erase racial identity, healthy racial identity, that doesn't create daily violence, as people use the phrase microaggression, racial microaggressions. I've never experienced a racial microaggression. I think any racial aggressions are aggressions. There's no micro to it. And we don't feel it. You know, Rich invokes the language of body. We don't feel these things in our head. We feel them in our body. The children feel them in their bodies. The teachers feel them in their bodies, the principals. And so there's this ripple effect that you speak to, that I hear from practitioners and have experienced myself and continue to experience in the academy. Even though I'm at an HBCU, I'm not always on Howard's campus, right? I'm not now. So, and wasn't 3 weeks ago when I was in Kansas. But my point is that this is real. This is real, and us languaging it, talking about it, and these kinds of forums where we can come together and strategize and speak honestly, I think that's the strength of your research, Rich, that it was provocative and honest, and buoyed us with quantitative data and some qualitative perspective. So we just continue this.
You know, one of the things I think about is on a university campus and how my white colleagues can sometimes try to manage the labor of my body. And so, you know, it's this constant struggle to negotiate space that they find to be worthy of my time and energy, when in fact I have my own agenda and my own convictions around what needs to happen. And so what happens to Black and I've spoken to enough brown colleagues as well, is that we find ourselves in spaces where we're negotiating and we're working overtime to do the work that's germane to our own research agendas and service orientations, and doing the work of our white colleagues when they feel uncomfortable addressing or uncomfortable dealing with an issue, right? And so it's a managing of our own labor that I think has to be disrupted, because, I sometimes say that we are, as academics, we're socially and psychologically drained insofar as we've allowed these white structures and white supremacy, right, to reify positions that make us sometimes believe we're losing our minds. And so I think there's this space, right, of you're doing what you are supposed to do and what you know you're supposed to do, and being very firm in what you're not going to do on behalf of someone else's agenda that may or may not be consistent with what's necessary for liberation.
Can you follow that?
I can't. But I am really thankful for your question because mine is in the same vein. So I'm Alexandria, and I'm a resident with Johns Hopkins and Urban Teachers. And so as part of this program, we are deeply committed to the work of culturally responsive pedagogy and creating great learning environments for all our students, but particularly our students of color. And sometimes within our school and parent communities, we can receive pushback for that. And at the end of a long day, after we've experienced perhaps some pushback, we have this amazing community that we can go back to, and even Mr. Schulman is made available to us whenever we need him. But I'm thinking about all the teachers that don't have that resource. And so I'm wondering if you guys could give some specific advice to the everyday stressed out teacher who sometimes feels like the Lone Ranger in this work. What are some resources and communities that they can go to? Or even what are some techniques that they can pull their community out of their school? Perhaps they don't see each other doing the same work. What advice would you give to teachers?
There's a reason I wanted to join Urban Teachers, is because I believe in our model. I've seen too many situations where we put in a Lone Ranger teacher and asking that person to do that job in that difficult environment. I can't say I can answer your question. I will say I've seen at times, not every time, local unions really do a good job of this for novice teachers, and they've really stepped up and they really bring those folks together. It's not universal in any way. I think it's lacking. I wish I had that answer. I mean, I think there's, I would hope Urban Teachers maybe is part of the solution, but I think it's got to be broader.
The Howard University Teacher Ed program is built on this asset model, and so the teacher education students are trained that when they enter a community, and you've probably had this experience as well, that you scan the community for its assets, because they're always there no matter how desolate the community may appear. Those assets could be in a Boys and Girls Club, those assets could be in a church, they could be in a sorority or fraternity or civic organization, and connect with those as part of your own foundation. So it could be that a sorority, Delta's, an African American sorority, they have programs in the church, or AKAs or Zetas. I mean to start something here. Alpha, yeah. I didn't mean to start anything here. My husband's an Omega, but these organizations are everywhere. They are pervasive, and they want to help, and they have an agenda around service, and they're parts of that community. And so I would just encourage asset mapping as a first step to providing not only resources to buoy you, but your students as well.
I would just add that, and to really pick up on the points that the themes that have emerged here already, and that is, I was actually doing a professional development session in the Northeast, and throughout the conversation, we were having a conversation about students' traumatic experiences, and in the midst of our conversation, the teachers started actually weeping, and in that moment, I was reminded of the vicarious trauma that many of them are experiencing as well. I think in the literature it's called caregiver fatigue, or so I think we can be. And someone posed a question about structures and systems. Why do we have to continue doing things the way we've done them in the past, right? Why can't we be innovative and think about opportunities for teachers to recharge, right? Opportunities for teachers to engage and have deep conversations with counselors and with psychological services,
Yes.
just as we would want and expect for our students, right? And it's this notion, right? This idea that hurting people hurt, right? And so I suspect we're grappling with a good number of teachers who are struggling themselves, right? Without structures and systems to propel them forward to do the work they need to be whole for the students they teach every day.
I'm told we have time for 2 more questions, and I've been going back and forth, but these 2 women have both been standing here for a long time. So I think I'm going to go to these 2 questions, and then I hope you can ask your question afterwards. I'm sorry, sir. Tell us who you are.
Thank you. My name is Sheena Washington. I am a special ed teacher of 8 years in Prince George's County, Maryland. I'm currently working with English language learners. First, I'd just like to say thank you so much. This has been incredible, and I'm so glad that I came tonight. My question is related to teacher leadership. So we've spoken about retention and issues of, teachers of color working in buildings where leadership doesn't look like them. But I'd like to talk about the notion of changing the dynamic of leadership within the buildings, where classroom teachers who have that firsthand experience with students are given opportunities to talk about scheduling, to talk about maybe restorative practices and other things that are not that are child-centered and not necessarily the curriculum that we get from the state. So if you could just speak a little bit more about where teacher leadership and trusting the teachers that are in the classroom with these students day in and day out, where that fits in with retention and leadership and trusting teachers of color when we're often not in leadership positions in our buildings.
I believe teachers should be leaders.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's essential, and the research supports it. So the idea is that teachers want to grow. They want to continue to grow. And one way to actually drive retention is to give them opportunities to actually add to their skill set, if you will. And as you think about teachers who don't want to go into administrative roles, this is a mezzanine level which hasn't been built into most collective bargaining agreements. I think it's a huge, someone used the word opportunity earlier, I think a huge opportunity to explore. In fact, it's funny, it's germane to, as I've been new to urban teachers, we're trying to think about what our alumni strategy is. How do we think about keeping those folks, invigorated? How do we think about retaining them? And how do we think about growing them? So unfortunately, I think it's been a missed opportunity, but one that's definitely within grasp.
Okay, last question.
Hi, my name is Natalia Christian. I am a first-year teacher. I teach. Thank you. I teach high school chemistry at Washington Latin Public Charter School here in DC, and I am a Howard alumna. First off, it's amazing and completely encouraging to be in a room filled with so many educators and superheroes. I grew such a deep appreciation for all of my professors this year once I saw how much goes into one lesson. Yes, so recently what I've been struggling with my kids, and I call them my kids even though I look just like them, is a lack of motivation and focus in my children of color. And I've been wondering, do my kids act the same way with me, with their only one of maybe 2 black teachers, as they act with their white teachers? Is their behavior the same way? And I observed one of my colleagues the other day, she's white, and I saw such a shift in their behavior between how they were in my class and how they were in my colleague's class. And I was trying to wrap my head around, okay, is there a distinction between me, who looks just like them, and my colleague? And Dr. Fenwick, when you said, who was the repository of intellect? Who was the authority? That struck me, because I'm like, how are they perceiving me? Is there a distinction mentally in these kids between who do I listen to, who do I pull myself together with, and who can I just, and I'm just trying to see if it's like, do they feel comfortable enough with me to be themselves, or is it, okay, you're not the authority, but like with them, I have to pull it together.
Mm-hmm. It's a profound question. You can't separate, right? You can't separate socialization from education. And children are being socialized every day outside of school through images that they see, their curriculum. They're being socialized by those images. And those images are telling them things about who's the repository of intellectual authority. And so I think some of that may be at play. But one of the things I often say is, you were a black child, right?
Yes, absolutely.
I was a black child. Rich was a black child. So when we have questions about black children, we can go to our foundational experiences. They don't exclusively shape what we know as African American black teachers, but we know what we experienced in schools, right? So I often caution my doctoral students, don't get these degrees and then start using your poetry voice. Black children, the black child. You were a black child.
Right.
You attended these schools. You knew what the barriers were. I saw my parents doing the barter from when I was very young. I'd look at my mom and dad and say, oh, they're trying to figure out where I and my brothers can go to learn and be safe and be affirmed. All parents want their children to learn and be safe and be affirmed. There's a racial dynamic to the conversation and the dance that we engage. But you have a group of students who have been socialized around what it means to learn, who is the teacher, and how will you connect with them? How will you connect with them in ways that are culturally authentic and meaningful to them and affirm them? Just like Rich began his paper. He was looking for a place where his twin daughters had their language and their dialect and their beauty and their hair affirmed.
Right.
So how can you do that for your children? I guarantee that if you start with affirmation, any teacher who starts with affirmation wins.
Yeah. You're right. I
That's
just
a good
wanted
way
to
to
say-
end.
Well, I can say I'm probably in the most unenviable position to, if you were at my home, I could tell you we'd go all night, there'd be chocolate flowing, and we'd have a great time. And there is a reception for those of you who are with us, both in we had a full house, so we do have overflow space, and we wish you were in this room, and we're, kind of hugging you for taking on the up and down of some of the technology, but we'll all be together at the reception. Those who virtually joined us, it's time to go to your own refrigerator. But, this has really been a feast. I don't want to overdo the metaphors. It was a wonderful string quartet, starting with Rich and the commentators, Leslie, Peter. And in case you were wondering why we gave the award to Emily, now we see, for her real contributions, really significant contributions to this domain and space. This is the 15th Brown Lecture, the first on the 50th anniversary of Brown, and it's very interesting to me that we can call it Brown, and that just communicates. That was Dr. Edmund Gordon. He was telling a story, his own story, and then with excellence in research, as we heard, such excellence in research, in data use, in statistics, and in scholarship across the spectrum of what makes for an important conversation. So AERA is committed both to collaborating with the students in the room, hearing your voices, especially, how many high schools are in the room? College students, great. Probably the rest are doing homework, so we welcome you. or should be doing, right? Not punishing homework, supportive and enabling homework. We're really pleased you're here. October 24th, use your PDA now, don't put the sound on. Same time next year, but recognize these are exactly the kinds of conversations, research, facts, truth, as Rich himself said in his early remarks, things that he thought were hypotheses, he falsified, and that iterative process is part of our collaborative learning experience. Good night, and join us for the reception.
Thank you.